respond to the us, our 30 million people, will move ahead. But I can tell you, as my colleague, Deputy Minister said, we are not going to the IMF. Whatever we do, we are not. The consequences are dire. We are a proud nation. We have the resources. We have the capacity. Don't let anybody tell you. Like when Joshua, Caleb, and the 10 others went to spy on the promised land. And only 2 of them came to say that we can do it. And the 10 went around the community murmuring, you can't, We are not people of short sight, you know. And we have to move on. Okay? So let's think of us as who we are, a proud, strong people, the shining star of Africa, and we have the capacity to do what we want to do. If only we can speak that one language and ensure that we burden share in the issues ahead.
Mr. Speaker, the E-levy is also going to help with the fiscal consolidation effort and reduce the debt levels of our country. And that also means that we are going to see an improved economic ratings and not returning to the International Monetary Fund, which is the only solution our friends on the other side have always preferred. Why don't you go to the IMF? Go to the IMF. We have shown that we have alternatives to building the economy of this country without resorting to conditionalities that will be imposed on this country.
This government knows that the wisest thing to do in these circumstances is to improve our reserve position, and that is to seek balance of payment support from multilateral institutions like the IMF. Because this balance of payment support will come at concessionary rates and at very minimal cost that are certainly nowhere near the astronomical and prohibitive cost that that is associated with this syndicated 1 billion loan. It is evident, therefore, that the solution to the problem lies with taking the bold steps to restructure our debt, to get some relief from pumping far too much revenue into debt servicing on an annual basis and channeling the savings into priority areas that will benefit our people directly. The Akufo-Addo administration knows this too well, but political posturing, empty grandstanding, and a morbid fear of their own pedestrian politicking around less serious problems of the recent past have immobilized and frozen them into action. Inaction which continues to run our economy aground and worsening the living conditions of our people by the day. And with this, I'm referring to their criticism of my administration when we decided to go to the IMF. They said it's only lazy governments that go to the IMF. And I mean, the words they said in that past have come to haunt them. So one of the reasons why they're afraid to go to the IMF is that what they said in the past will follow them. It will serve the president well to use some items from the presidential toolkits in times of crisis such as this. There's a toolkit with some items in it that presidents can use when they are faced with this kind of crisis. The first is he should address the nation and explain the situation in which we are and rally the support of the citizens behind any economic program that he wants to put forward. The second is he should fire his finance minister. His finance minister is his cousin. He's afraid to fire him because of the relations they have. He is not inclined to do so. He should conduct a major shake-up of his government to remove all the many dead woods that have turned ministries into their kingdoms. And then finally, he should huddle with the best brains of this country to formulate a comprehensive recovery plan for our economy. Many of the ministers who have superintended over ministries that are non-performing have political links with the president, and therefore it makes it impossible for him to remove them from their positions, even when he himself can see that some of those ministers have presidential ambitions. And I mean, it should be easy for you to remove them so that they can concentrate on their presidential ambitions, but not this president. I suggested to him to do a Sinchi-style forum, like we did, gather all the best brains in the country to think through, because they say, Nyansa ni obako fotim.
Right, so you heard Ken Ofori-Atta earlier, and then you heard John Kuma. Ken Ofori-Atta is the Minister of Finance, and John Kuma is the Deputy Minister of Finance, and then you heard former President John Dramani Mahama. Right, so as you already are familiar with the narrative, this government has insisted that going to the IMF was a no-no, and that, in fact, it was a sign of incompetence in the management of the economy. There are previous comments by the former president, previous comments by President Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, Dr. Bawumia, Mahmoud Bawumia, and members of the present government who came to the conclusion with such convincing emphasis that going to the IMF was the sign that the government was incompetent at managing the economy. The question now is, what happened? Joining me for this discussion are Bright Simmons, his Honorary Vice President, Imani Africa, Professor Charles Godfred Aka, Associate Professor of Economics, Institute of Statistical, Social and Economic Research, that's ISE, and former Director, Center for Social Policy Studies, University of Ghana, Legon. Felix Kwachio-Fosu is former Deputy Communications Minister and NDC parliamentary candidate for Ebura Asebu Kwaman Kese. He is an aide to the former president. Also joining us is Eliklim Komla Blodjo, who is Associate Professor, Department of Finance, University of Ghana Business School. Gentlemen, good morning, and thank you so very much for making time to join us on Newsfile. Yeah, thank you.
Good morning.
Right.
Good morning.
Okay, so if we may start with Professor Charles Godfred Aka. This was obvious. It was coming. The NDC's, members of parliament ranking as far as finance is concerned, Kesel Atofo-Singh, Isaac Adongo, the rest of them, Seth Tekpe, former finance minister, have all been saying for quite a while now, including professors of economics and finance, especially at the University of Ghana, have been saying for a while now that we had to go to the IMF.
Well, thank you. Good morning to your cherished viewers and listeners. Well, I think the IMF, going to IMF has always remained a temptation. That's how I see it. But I don't think, well, I don't think it's the most prudent decision to take at this point. And if you allow me, I will lay down my argument for that.
Please go on.
I think we need to first find out what is the IMF basically there to do. And I think the IMF is a useful institution, has a very good history, and it has been very supportive to many struggling economies, including Ghana. We've been there 16 times. So I don't want to despise or underrate their significance or importance for crisis situations and economies that need them. But under the current circumstances that we find ourselves, I don't think, in my honest opinion, that IMF is going to give us the sustainable solutions to the problem that we have. Why do I say so? I think that the first thing for us to analyze is what is the problem? We need to do an anatomy of the challenges that we have. And if you see that the challenges we have, there are some of them self-inflicted. It's a conglomeration of bad luck and bad governance over the years. It's a leadership problem that we have had since independence. And IMF is not going to fix that leadership problem, and it's not going to lead us to the sustainable long-term development that we have. The problem that Ghana has, as far as I'm concerned, it's a structural problem. And the reason why the 16 times we've gone to IMF has not been really sustainable is because they just come to give you some temporary short-term steroids or something to help you to survive the pain. And then after 2-3 years, we are back to the same structural issues. And I think it's about time we sat down as a nation. I support any suggestion for us to put our heads together, whether it's a century or is a wherever consensus, to think what is the policy goal and what is the long-term development agenda of a nation. Actually, what's our aspiration? What's the vision? Where do we want Ghana to be in the next 20 years, 25 years, 15 years? And as I'm speaking, there's no such a policy document that you can lay hands on and say, well, this is our aspiration over the next 20, 30 years. And these are the policies and the strategies that we need to adopt to be able to become a Malaysia or a Singapore or a United States. We don't have that. So we need to fix the problem. What is the problem we have on our hand? The problem we have on our hand is basically high inflation. Inflation that is coming as a result of, exchange rate crisis that we are having, which actually is influenced by our net exports being low because we are exporting primary commodities. We don't get enough foreign exchange from that. And then we are an import-dependent economy that imports basically almost everything. We have borrowed a lot over the years. We have spoken about government's penchant for high borrowing for a long time. And that borrowing has gone up, and therefore most of them is external. So the interest service, which is in dollars, is also beginning to bite us. We are running over the years huge government size in terms of the public sector. And we have talked about trying to reduce expenditure inefficiencies. All of those things have not been resolved. Then we now have unfortunately, the pandemic. The pandemic came, and of course, as many countries are suffering, even well-developed countries, we are suffering. And I think we need to applaud the government that they actually saved lives. And I think most of the policies they introduced helped a lot, especially the health ones to deal with the COVID, and some of the support to businesses and to households. I think it's been well touted all over the world that the government can receive some credit for that. So, of course, that has now hit our budget to the extent that we are running budget deficits and we are borrowing again. And then now the Ukraine and Russia war has also exacerbated the situation where there are global disruptions in addition to the COVID, and therefore we are having critical challenges with the food prices here and there because even though we are a blessed country, Africa and Ghana, we're still dependent on places like Ukraine for grains, and still import tomatoes and many other things, unfortunately. So these things are the ones that are pushing inflation. So if inflation is not demand push inflation, okay, and it's a cost issue, basically fuel prices going up, food prices going up, the IMF is not the solution for that, in my view. So we need to...
Those are the historical problems. And then recent, issues coming up financially or economically. But you said it's bad luck and bad governance. What do you mean by bad governance?
Well, bad governance because, of course, and I'm not talking about the current government. I'm talking about, probably since 1992.
But the current government was so certain that we would not go to IMF. That suggests that at a point, at least, they were satisfied that we were cruising to a point where we didn't have to go to IMF. Of course, our peers in Africa and the world applauded us that we were doing well with our economy as the second biggest economy in, is it West Africa?
Yeah, I think we were doing well. And we need to see, if you look at the history, we were doing well. And until Doomsor came, for example, it affected the Mahama government severely. And they had to go to IMF in 2015 or so. And it was partly because of 5 years of Doomsor. Okay, so anytime we have crisis, in 2008, 2009, President Kufuor, again, 2007, 2008, we have global food and financial crisis. Our economy was vulnerable. We were affected. It's partly the reason why President Kufuor lost the election. Then President Mahama and co came. They were doing quite well. And then we have the Doomsor, and then everything went down. Our GDP growth average was about 3% or so. So that was quite bad. Then when the NPP came, they were actually doing well. We began to grow around 6-7% more. We found oil also, luckily. So things were quite good until, sometimes when you are doing well, you can become complacent. But apart from that, again, we are hit with the COVID, and we are hit with also another external war. So I seem to support the earlier statement by the finance minister and all those who said that we are not going to IMF. We are not going to IMF. We are not going to IMF because we didn't need to go to IMF. We didn't need to go. The IMF is like a hospital. Okay, so if you are not sick, you don't go there. Okay, but unfortunately, we have gotten ourselves sick. And if we have gotten ourselves sick, then IMF is one option. But I am saying that we are already in the crisis. What brought us here, we can discuss. But what is the way out? What is the way out? And for me, the way out is still domestic. It's still domestic. And I don't know if I should make my substantive presentation.
As in the way out, I think you hold on with that for a while. But I wanted to find out from you, when you say, you suggest that we had an option and we could decide not to go to the IMF. When you're reading from international business news reports, it does appear that at this point we didn't have an option. The Bloomberg, for example, says that after failing to find cheaper sources of funding, President Akufo-Addo's government on Friday said Africa's second largest gold and cocoa producer, what an irony, largest gold and cocoa producer, in fact, some add oil producer as well, will seek a bailout from the IMF. The nation's dollar reserves, please note that the nation's dollar reserves dropped to $8.3 billion at the end of April from $9.7 billion at the end of last year. According to the central bank, the country's public debt increased to 78% of gross domestic product at the end of March. And the rate on the $250 million loan, $50 million loan, is far lower than the 23.27% yield on Ghana's dollar bond maturing in 5 years, a level that locks West Africa's second biggest economy out of the Eurobond market. We've been locked out of the Eurobond market. Ghana lost access. We lost access this year due to higher debt and budget deficit levels, partly caused by the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. So we have no option, do we?
We have option.
Really?
So basically, yes. And I belong to the school of thought that believes that our problems can be solved internally. I honestly believe that. And I think if Africa continues to do the kind of things we are doing, it will take us another 1,000 years, and we will still be the poorest continent and the poorest country. As I'm talking to you now, Japan's debt to GDP ratio is about 260%. And Japan is not in crisis, and they're not going to IMF. Even the United States debt to GDP is almost 140%. China is about 70%. They're not going to IMF.
The countries you are making the comparison with, is that not such an odious comparison to make?
No, because it's normalized. It's debt to GDP is GDP. So basically, based on your GDP, there's a certain level of debt. So it doesn't really matter. And even we need more debt. See, there's no problem with debt to GDP. There's no higher level objectively determined that this is the debt to GDP that you must not go. It depends on where you are borrowing from and your ability to service it and what you are using the debt to do. As a country, as long as there's opportunity to invest and to invest in productive resources, areas that will create long-term growth, education, infrastructure, job creation, to get all these youth that went to demonstration, those that you see at the traffic lights in their numbers, all those youth that are unemployed, almost 25% of the youth graduates unemployed. Any solution, any debt or deficit that you run to run a full employment, to engage such people, in the long term will give you growth that will sterilize any debt, that will come back to pay the debt if you raise the taxes from it. So how do we finance this? Is the discussion. The role of the government is the last resort.
Okay.
It cannot be said that the government has run out of money.
Let me go around. Let me go around and pick other views, and then return to take what you say is your way forward. What is your way forward? And joining us also by Zoom is Gabi Asare Ochre Dako. Now, let me get Professor Komla Agloyo's, views. Is it really the case that we have an option? Because by my reading, we have been going to the Eurobond market since the start of the government. We have been going to the Eurobond market and celebrating the rates at which we get and how they embrace and even oversubscribe, so to speak. And now we are told that we have simply been shut out of that market. We have lost access due to the ballooning unsustainable debt. Yes. Do we have an option?
Okay, good morning, Samson, and good morning to your cherished listeners. So, well, I think that the signs have been on the wall for a long time. And the situation in which we are, I think that the most viable option now is to seek for IMF support. And the IMF is the international lender of last resort. If you have run out of options, then it will provide you with balance of payment support and other types of support. Okay, so I think that the signs have been there for a while, since February, early in the year. Okay, it was clear that we needed a bailout from the IMF due to a number of reasons. Okay, I will mention those that Professor Aka hasn't talked on. So one, like you mentioned, we have lost access to the global capital markets. We can no longer issue Eurobonds. The E-levy was supposed to give us some revenue, okay, to fill the revenue gap. However, the uptake has not been as much as was anticipated by the government. Okay, so this year we haven't raised as much from
from the E-levy. So it means that we still have revenue shortfalls. Again, we've seen a decline in our foreign exchange reserves. And in particular, BDCs, for example, need about $400 million every month to import oil into this country. The Bank of Ghana is only able to provide about $100 million. So clearly there's exchange market pressure on the cedi. Again, we've seen rising oil prices, grain prices, rising inflation, and also volatility in capital flows. Okay, so given that interest rates in advanced economies are increasing, then it's appealing for investors to invest in, let's say, the US or other countries because their interest rates are increasing. And that leads to what we call capital flow reversals. Okay, so instead of investors investing in our economy, they withdraw their portfolio investments and then invest in countries like the US, UK, Australia, etc. So that has also been happening. Again, we're expecting $2 billion, I think, as a loan facility. I'm not sure that has come in yet, and consequently means that we don't have foreign exchange reserves because that money hasn't come in yet. We've also seen the demonstrations in the streets. Okay, I think it's the Arise Ghana demonstrations also. And again, that's a sign that people are suffering, that there's political unrest, and that we probably need to go to the IMF as the international lender of last resort. So those signs have been there. Of course, the government said they wouldn't go due to political will and pride. We said that we're Ghana beyond aid, meaning that we wouldn't take aid from foreign countries and that we will be self-sufficient. So I was actually taken by surprise by the announcement that we're going to the IMF.
You were surprised?
Yes, I was actually surprised. Because,
if you are surprised, then it means that there is an option.
Okay, so my surprise was that since February, I anticipated that we'll need a bailout from the IMF. And when the government said that it wasn't going to go, I started putting together data from a number of countries. And I'm still building my model. I was trying to build a machine learning model to help predict whether we need to take an IMF bailout or not. I'm not done with that work, and then the announcement came in. So I was actually taken by surprise. And of course, the government had said that if you go to the IMF, it's a sign of a retrogression in the economy. It's an admission that things are bad. Okay, so I wasn't expecting us to go for an IMF deal based on what the government itself has said. And my thinking was that we'll probably look for domestic solutions. So probably maybe go to the AFDB, the African Development Bank, for some support. And again, going to the IMF comes with conditionalities. Okay, so for example, you have to freeze public employment, you may have to freeze wage increases, you may have to take off subsidies on goods like utilities, etc. Okay, so I was very, very surprised that that announcement came yesterday.
Yeah. But conditionalities, conditions, as we know, it's a new IMF, even though this is not like really, really very new. You now go there with your own programs and ask for support for those programs. So it is not as bad as it used to be. That's how come we were able to generate Senchi and then go to them and say, this is what we have. Will you endorse it to give us, is it credibility?
Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much. The IMF provides various types of support. Okay, so it's not always lending. Okay, one of the supports IMF provides is what we call surveillance. So they will monitor your policies and give you advice so that you have stronger policies to promote growth and reduce balance of payment problems. So that's an option that we can go for, policy advice. It doesn't necessarily have to be a loan. Okay, the IMF also provides capacity building for countries so that they can improve revenue generation, manage their public finances, be more efficient with monetary policy. Okay, so it's not always that you go for a loan. And of course, given the IMF's credibility in the past and the experience of African countries in the 1980s and 1990s due to the structural adjustment policies, The IMF itself knows that these countries don't want to come to them. And like you said, the IMF is trying to craft out a new image for itself. Okay, but whatever the case is, there will still have to be some agreements on the policies that the government is going to implement. And certainly we'll have to be more prudent in our spending. We'll have to find ways to increase revenue, etc.
Right. Before you take a breather and then we get to, if you like, the politicians, we are being told that we should be a little bit, cautious and not even overly optimistic that once we are beginning the engagement, then it's a fait accompli that we will get what we are looking for. And examples are being, referred to us about Sri Lanka and a few others that have been knocking on the doors of the IMF for a while now, and they are not making success because the IMF need to see your books that you must assure of sustainable debt. How does it look like for Ghana? What can you say?
Okay, so yes, it's not a fait accompli. Okay, like you rightly said, Sri Lanka had been in talks with the IMF for the past 10 days and they were not able to reach a deal with the IMF. Of course, they are still talking to see if they can reach some common grounds. Okay, so there's no guarantee that we're actually going to get an IMF deal. We would have to put forward our policies that we want to implement. What kind of facility do we want to even take? Okay, even among the loans that the IMF provides, there are different types. You have what we call the policy support instrument, which is when they just support your policies, they don't give you a loan. You have what you call the extended credit facility, okay, which is for medium-term balance of payment support. You have extended fund facility, which is more long-term. You have standby credit facility, which you can also access. And the standby credit facility is for short-term shocks. Okay, so it depends on what policies we want to implement and what kind of support we want. As we said, I'm not sure the package that we are looking for, whether it's an extended credit facility, which is medium term, whether it's a standby credit facility, which is short term, or whether we are just looking for policy support for the programs that we intend to implement.
The letter or communique issued and signed by the information minister is clear, isn't it? Is that not enough? That we are looking for balance of payment support?
Yes, but there are different times. So it could either be a short-term balance of payment support, okay, which will be the standby credit facility, or we could go for an extended credit facility, which is a bit medium term.
Okay. All right. So, Professor Godfrey Daka, can you say something briefly about this? Because should we be compared with countries like Sri Lanka, who the IMF is insisting must whittle down their existing debt to sustainable levels before they can receive any, support? Is Ghana's case as bad as countries like that?
No, I don't think our case is that desperate. And that's why I said that I don't think we are at the point where we need to go to IMF. If we get to that point, I will definitely support an IMF program when we have lost all options. What's happening in Sri Lanka, it's more desperate situation. And again, they have decided not to use their internal mechanisms. I always want us to use internal mechanisms. Ghana, I think we are still growing. We are still one of the fastest growing economies in Africa. Okay, so we still have the institutions. Our export is still not that bad, even though we could enhance more export. Remittances are still quite high. It's just basically we need to look at our expenditure and introduce more efficiency. And we have overborrowed in terms of the foreign component of our debt, and therefore the debt servicing is too high. And I think that we are not getting the best we have to get from fiscal policy and from monetary policy. And I think these are the two institutions that we need to have a discussion. What is the role of the central bank and what is the role of the Ministry of Finance in dealing with inflationary pressures and in leading us to a sustainable development that engages full resources in the economy and create jobs. That's the discussion. And I don't see the IMF playing a role. The IMF role, I mean, look at the last amount of money they gave us. For 3 years, 918 million US dollars, about 300,000 US dollars a year. What would that do? Okay, so it could help you pay some salaries and deal with other issues. It won't build a road. It won't dualize the road to Kumasi. It won't put a railway from Elubu to Tamale or to Navrongo. It will not create jobs. And on top of that, they came with conditionalities. All IMF program will force you like they're trying to force Sri Lanka. Even whether they don't impose it or you have to impose it on yourself, you have to slow down on certain things. So we, at the last one, we decided to slow down. That's why they were not hiring nurses and teachers and many other things. It will still happen again. And it means that we are sacrificing employment for inflation. And that is what I don't want us to do. Okay. The situation of Ghana, the Ghana's problem is more of unemployment than inflation.
Now
inflation of 27% is not that critical.
Okay, let me come to the politicians, like I said earlier. Very briefly before you start your substantive issue.
Sure.
That comparison that is coming up should not be there, because in Sri Lanka things have gotten really worse. They can't even get fuel. You know, in the last few days, people have to queue and people have to wait for days, and they have to make a determination that, you know, fuel has to be given for, you know, essential and important uses, not for just any use. We are not there, and we are not likely to get there. So we shouldn't be making that comparison, right?
We will get there in very short order. Indeed, I refer you to a publication in the International Wires in which the IMF's chief economist is quoted. I think she's also a renowned professor in Harvard. She makes it clear that countries like Ghana, Laos are on the verge of becoming like Sri Lanka. And indeed, her points are corroborated by government's own first quarter outings. I'm quite surprised that Professor Aka, and with the greatest respect to him, I'm surprised that he's saying that there are other options and that we are not at the point where we should go to the IMF. This government has gone to the IMF because there is no other option. It is not like there's an option that government could have pursued. There's none. The only way out is to go to the IMF. Even that is not enough to address the problem we have, because they have left it very, very late. Now, the MPP have become a victim of their own cheap pedestrian politics. You see, we've gone to the IMF 16 times, as many people have said. Up until 2015, IMF programs were not really such a big deal, until the likes of Bawumia and Gabi and Akufo-Addo decided to make it a political hot potato for the NDC administration. So they doubled in all manner of false claims and demonized the IMF, made them look like they were a bunch of people with horns and tails wielding pitchforks to force problems down our throats, and that they were never going to go there. So it is not surprising seeing how humiliated they've become. I mean, the IMF announcement has become like a thunderbolt among the ranks of the MPP. They are so humiliated and disgraced, they can't even man up and mount any credible defense of why they are going. They have been forced there, and the reason why they are there is that they have no option. Now, government has published the first quarter outcomes for 2022. If you look at it, we are in such dire straits that if we don't go to the IMF, we will go the way of Sri Lanka in short order. Look at government's revenue, for instance. They projected that this first quarter, between January and March, they were going to make 14.6 billion Ghana cedis in total tax revenue. They managed to get 12.8 billion Ghana cedis, which is a shortfall of almost 2 billion Ghana cedis. Now, listen to this. Our total debt service for the first quarter was 13.9 billion Ghana cedis, which is 108% of all the money that government collected in taxes. So they were left with virtually nothing to do anything and had to borrow.
Sorry, go over that again.
I'm saying that if you look at the first quarter outcomes that government has put out, they projected that they were going to collect 14.6 billion Ghana cedis in taxes, including E-levy. They managed to collect 12.8 billion actually, which is a shortfall of about 2 billion. Now, total debt service in terms of interest and amortization alone took 13.9 billion Ghana cedis in the first quarter. This is 108% of the taxes that government collected. they had to borrow in order to pay salaries and meet other commitments. If you look at the same outcomes that they've published, indeed, they earmarked that in the first quarter of this year, they will pay contractors to the tune of 1.3 billion Ghana cedis. They were only able to pay 38 million Ghana cedis. They also earmarked that they will pay 285 million in other arrears clearance. They were not able to pay a dime out of it. And you and I know the tall list of creditors that government has that is unable to pay. Again, our cedi is taking a fall and it is depreciating. If you add that to inflation and all the other macroeconomic indices that are pointing south, it's created a huge problem. At one point, the share of domestic bonds that was held by non-resident investors, in other words, foreign investors, was 35%. It has dwindled to 15%. And so our reserves have dwindled by $1.7 billion. And the problem is mounting. Look, in 2 weeks' time, 6.2 billion Ghana cedis in domestic bonds will mature and we have to pay. Normally, what happens is that the foreign investors who hold our domestic bonds, they just roll over. So government has some space to operate. Now they are demanding that they should be paid. So we have to fork out 3.1 billion to pay them. That is almost $500 million. And it's going to hit our reserves even further. So government is in an extremely difficult situation. So when people seek to make excuses for them and say that there are options, I'm surprised that they can look at these figures and mount this sort of defense. Again, there's often an attempt, to compare us to countries that we have no business comparing ourselves with. I've heard people compare us to Japan, the US. They say, oh, Japan has debt-to-GDP ratio of 260%. So if we have about 80%, it is not such a disaster. Look, it is a disaster for us. Japan borrows at such a low rate. They borrow under 1%. In addition to that, they use a fraction of their revenue to service debt. So they don't have the sort of fiscal rigidities that we have. In 2021, we used 92% of our tax revenue to service debt. The first quarter of this year, we used 108% of tax revenue to service debt. And people can look at this and claim that there were options. If there were options, given how arrogant and proud this government is, they would not have opted for the IMF. The sad part is that they have waited too long. They should have gone immediately after the elections when they noticed that we were in trouble. And often, they have sought to blame COVID. You see, we have dismissed the COVID narrative and excuse for the simple reason that Ghana...
You dismiss it entirely?
You see, COVID is a leveler. It affected almost every country on earth. And the most effective comparison you can make to see whether our situation is indeed comparable to our peers is to look at what has happened in the West African sub-region. There's none of the countries in West Africa that is posting the sort of outcomes that we are posting. Ours is such an outlier that there's something more fundamental than just COVID. And something you and I know that as far back as 2019, it was evident that we were heading for the precipice. Our deficit and debt were going out of gear. This government somehow convinced itself that it was on the right path, despite cautions and notes of warnings from various actors within the economic space of Ghana. They insisted that they were doing the right thing. Our deficit was topping 7% in 2019. Our debt-to-GDP ratio was nearing 70%. Yet they found creative accounting means. They hid the deficit under so-called below-the-line items and were understating our debt, and therefore it was impacting our debt-to-GDP ratio. That is how they thought they could get away with it. But now things have come to a head, and they do not have an option. Now the timing is so late that the IMF program in and of itself is not going to help address the problem, because our biggest problem is our public debt. As I speak to you, it is nearing 400 billion Ghana cedis. And I suspect that the IMF will table as a precondition, or if you like, prior action, that something be done about our debt. Because you see, the IMF is also a lender. The money they will give to us is part of a revolving fund. We need to show an ability to pay so that when another country is in trouble, they can help them. So if they get a hint that our debt is not sustainable and we cannot pay, they will ask that we do something about debt. Now, what would they ask that we do? They will ask us to restructure. In other words, we should engage our creditors and have interest payments and other obligations deferred up to a point where our debt becomes sustainable. We have space in order to be able to pay. Now, there are missed opportunities, Samson. In 2020, the G20 set up what they call the Debt Service Support Initiative under the supervision of the IMF and the World Bank. where they allowed countries that were heavily debt burdened, like ours, to have some relief, so that coupled with the problems that COVID was posing, they will be able to get some relief and maneuver their way around the problems. Our government stubbornly refused to access this program. You see, the way that our debt structure is now, about 20% of it is held by multilateral and bilateral agencies, World Bank, IMF, E-levy, and what have you. 80% of it is commercial. If we had accessed the DSSI, at least we would have had some relief and some space on the 20% that multilateral held. But we forwent that. Only last week, President Akufo-Addo was in Brussels lamenting that the DSSI was not renewed after 2021. But the DSSI was available at least between May 2020 and December 2021. You refused to access it. And now you are lamenting that it is no longer available. So this government has been obstinate. But they would not listen.
The debt issue that we talk about, you know how much of it is blamed on the Mahama regime.
How is it? Look, when we left power, our debt-to-GDP ratio was 57%. We had total debt of 120 billion. Indeed, the highest amount we spent servicing debt was 10.6 billion Ghana cedis in 2016. Now, this year, all things being equal, they will spend about 50 billion Ghana cedis servicing debt. So our debt position was nowhere near what we have now. We had much more space to operate, even though we had fewer resources. This government has had over 500 billion Ghana cedis to operate. If after all of this, you find yourself in this situation, you cannot blame anybody but yourself. They took reckless decisions. Look, when COVID struck, it was the duty of government to proof citizens against the effects. So their primary responsibility had to do with ensuring that the disease does not spread and that people were protected. But they saw elections coming. And so they went ahead and did things that we could not afford. That is what left us with a 15.6% budget deficit after the 2020 elections. Go to Cote d'Ivoire. Their deficit was under 7%. Look, what did you do that Cote d'Ivoire did not do? How many people have died or contracted COVID in Cote d'Ivoire? That is more than what we got. Even Nigeria, with their size, have less than 2,000 deaths. We have in excess of 800 deaths. Benin, Togo, even Sierra Leone, Liberia, all have deficits below 7%. We had a deficit of 15.6%. They were also impacted by COVID. What did we do here that they did not do? The difference is that we had elections coming up. And this government saw COVID as an excuse to spend beyond our means in order to create an artificial feel-good factor for electoral outcomes.
Okay.
Those countries did not have that. So this IMF program basically was the only option available to this government. And before you go, I crave your indulgence. There's one point that I need to make. You see, people speak about conditionalities. When we went in 2015, we went with our own homegrown policies. And the IMF agreement is published on the IMF website. Anybody can read it. The IMF did not change anything beyond insisting that we do not have central bank financing. So zero central bank financing in 2015 and 2016. That is the only thing that they changed. Okay. Again, there's a false notion that is out there that when we went to the IMF, they insisted that we do job cuts. That is not true. The agreement is out there, and I encourage anybody to Google it and read. The IMF did not insist on net freezing. Since 2008, under President Kufuor, the then the finance minister, Kojo Banredu, he sent out a circular that government was trying to rein in the wage bill. And therefore, it was minded to clamp down on indiscriminate employment within the public sector without real cost to the finance ministry. So he issued an edict that it is only when vacancies exist in the public sector that people were to be employed. So that's what you call a net freeze. You only replace people who leave. When we came to power in 2009, we inherited that. We expanded and said, no, we will make an exemption for health, that is nurses, doctors, and other health professionals, education, teachers, and then security agencies, that's the police, military, and what have you. So we even ring-fenced this and said that as for these sectors, there will be no net freeze, and that once they needed to recruit, they should do recruitment. But unfortunately, Bawumia and the MPP bastardized this position and made it seem like it was a new development. So when people hear IMF, they ascribe these things to, but that is not the case. The IMF only insists that you live within your means. And something, if you do not live within your means, you will fall into debt. So the IMF are not demons. They will only assist you, but before they give you their money, they must make sure that you can pay. And how do they assure themselves that you can pay?
All right.
By ensuring that you live within your means, you do the things you can afford, so that we don't have this cyclical 8-year bust, where we go bust and then we have to run back to them. So if this government is minded to be disciplined, we will not have the problems that we are having now.
Thank you. Now, Gabi Asari Ocheredako is Managing Partner, Africa Legal Associates. Thank you very much. He's no stranger to this platform, but it's been a long time. Thank you for making time to join us, Gabi. Please unmute your mic.
Yeah, I just did, yes.
Great.
Yes, it's been a while. Hi, Felix.
Right. Okay, so we started the week with you giving hints by tweets that this was likely to happen. What do we know from the side of government that eventually led to this decision?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that government has been transparent in terms of the challenges. I think in all the times that the finance minister has gone to parliament, he spoke about challenges. And I think if you look at the history of the MPP in office, when they recognize a challenge, as President Kufuor recognized in 2001, they bring in a policy to offer solutions, as they did with HIPC. In 2021, or in 2020, if you look at where we were in 2019, it was pretty obvious that the economy was under control. Inflation, we ended the year with inflation at 7.9%. For the 2 years, growth was 7% averaging, as compared to 3.7% in 2016, the lowest for more than 25 years. So it was pretty obvious, even though, yes, you could say that the debt to GDP ratio was high. It has breached the 50%, going upwards. But it was obvious that the country was under good hands. And then, of course, COVID hit. Now, I've seen many a times, as we just heard Felix do, that the whole COVID thing is underplayed. But when you look at economies across the world, and you can say that, yes, in the UK, inflation is 9% now. But in 2019, inflation was actually minus 25% in the UK. And now it has shot up, about 600%. So when you look at it, you look at the UK, you look at whether it's Cote d'Ivoire, whether it's America, whether it's Japan, whether it's Ghana, inflation has gone up. When you look at it, we all take fuel from the same place. Around this time in 2014, we were queuing in Ghana for oil in terms of petrol. You go to filling station, you couldn't even get petrol because we didn't have foreign exchange. We went into the IMF in 2015 when there was no global crisis. We went into the IMF in 2015 when we had just added oil to our resources 2 years prior. Okay, so it is quite different from the situation in 2015 as it is now. I mean, if I just quote something that the IMF...
Professor Godfrey Daka refers to the Dumso as a crisis situation, part of the reason we had to go to IMF.
You can say so. You can say so, because we had a situation, it wasn't just Dumso, it was the price of turning our lights on. If you remember clearly, we had a situation in this country where hotels, not just hotels, businesses were actually working just to pay their electricity bill. Okay? It took a decision in 2018 to actually reduce electricity bills, not just in nominal terms, but in real terms. That cost money. And if you remember, for the past 6 years, and we'd never seen it in this country before, you've had a situation where electricity prices in real terms have not even gone. It's still lower than the rate of inflation, lower than the rate of depreciation. So things were being done prior to COVID hitting to make sure that the space for employment, the space for economic growth was expanded. And all these happened. So to sit and say that it has been reckless on the part of government, I find that pretty rich coming from the NDC. But beyond that,
I wanted to ask you this. When I think all reasonable people will agree that you can't downplay COVID, and you can't also take away the Ukraine-Russia crisis. But from where you sit, what percentage of COVID is blamable for why we are where we are?
Okay, let me just quote something to you. This is the MD of the IMF in April 2022. To put it simply, we are facing a crisis on top of a crisis. First, the pandemic. Second, the war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The economic consequences from the war spread fast and far to neighbors and beyond, hitting hard as the world's most vulnerable people. Ghana has not been an exception. I speak to you, I'm not in Ghana. Where I am, okay, the tenants, okay, are complaining because their electricity bill has gone up, gas bill has gone up from £1,000, £11,000 in a month to £60,000. Okay, where I'm sitting now, I'm not in Ghana. And I don't think anybody can say that what is happening in Ghana is peculiar to Ghana. It is not. You are saying that COVID played a role, but what about the other circumstances? Yes, of course, because there's vulnerability in our system. And what you have to ask yourself is, what was the government doing about it? So government came to Parliament in November 2021 and said that, look, we are not in a good situation. We intend to raise this amount of money in order to deal with the situation. And it introduced a policy. Government introduced a policy, made these calculations based on the E-levy, that it thought that it could raise enough money if all been well. We've had Felix Kwashi giving us numbers in terms of projections that government made, that it would have raised X amount of money, it fell short by 2 billion. Now ask ourselves, why did that happen? It happened because for 6 months, one of the main tools of raising money for this year, okay, was frustrated in Parliament. And we heard on Monday.
Gabi, sorry, but there's a reason. There's a reason I ask if it was possible to apportion how much of the problem is blamable on COVID and the external issues we are talking about.
But the thing is, you have to just look at the numbers in 2019. And I'm saying that in 2019, if you look at in terms of our revenue to debt servicing, it was not where it is now. If you look at our numbers in terms of debt to GDP ratio, it was nowhere near where it is now. And if you remember, even in 2019, government has passed a law, okay, to impose a ceiling on budget deficit. It was 5%, and they hit it. Okay, so in terms of managing the economy, there were challenges, but the policies were working. And I think that's how we have to look at it. No one can say that it's only because of COVID we are here. We had challenges. That's why we went to the IMF in 2015. That's why we couldn't even come out of it. We went off track in 2016 and came back on track 2017, 2018. So there were challenges. But
the reason I'm asking, so that we get a certain fair idea, because I was saying any reasonable person will admit that. I think it's most unreasonable for anybody to say COVID or Ukraine doesn't play any role at all. But the World Bank has said earlier, the World Bank country director had said earlier that the macroeconomic challenges persisted even before the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic. And he said, quote, yes, COVID-19 has not helped, but even before COVID-19, there were signs that the situation was getting a little bit challenging, end quote.
But I can't dispute that, because the situation was challenging in 2014 and 2015 when we went to the IMF. Nobody can dispute that. Okay, but the point is, what was the trajectory that the country was on? Those are the things that you have to look at. And let me give you a few examples. If you look at, in terms of exchange rate levels, okay? By 2017, let me just give it to you, okay? 2017, it was minus 4.9%, okay? By December 2019, it was minus 3.9%. Where is it now? Okay, so you could see, and when you look at the trajectory, that's the point I'm making. It is obvious that steps were being taken to deal with that, but there were weaknesses, fundamental weaknesses within the system. So what did COVID do? And when you look at the numbers, not just in Ghana, when you look at inflation, we've seen about 350% increase, okay, in inflation from December 2019 to May 2022. You can look at other countries like the US, they've seen over 400%. Like the UK, they've seen over 600%. Okay, 700% in fact. Like the EU, they've seen 600%. So all these things are happening. But my point is, and I think that's why we have to focus on, okay, it's government saw the challenges and it went to Parliament and said that, look, I need to raise revenues through E-levy. Okay, because that's the only way I think that we can contain the situation.
How do you reconcile that statement to suggest proactive planning to the fact that only a couple of weeks ago, government was still insistent that we are not going to the IMF?
Which government?
This government.
2 weeks ago. Quote me who said in 2 weeks ago that we're not going to the IMF.
Before the finance minister himself told all of us about what they were cutting back on government, as it were, cutting back on salaries and the rest of them. He had already gone to Parliament to say that we have an E-levy we want to introduce. So that was after, not before.
Yes, but I'm not too sure why you think we are saying different things. What I'm saying is that government saw a situation, went to Parliament. We have a Parliament where it's not a situation where you could say the minority will have their say and government will have its way. We don't have such a Parliament. And if you remember, on Monday, the minority leader was actually bragging, taking credit for frustrating government's attempt to raise money, delaying that by 6 months. Now, I'm not too sure how any government in Ghana's situation would have rescued it, because you have a major way of raising revenue, which has been frustrated for 6 months. Okay, so my point is, yes, there were challenges. Yes, government came with its policies to see how to address those challenges. And those policies were frustrated by the very Parliament that we have. So yes, we are in a difficulty, but if you're a government, and even if you don't intend to go to the IMF, but you are put in a situation where your avenues of raising revenue are being closed, whether through parliamentary action or by public rejection, then you have to tackle it. And I believe that whatever you say, we are in the IMF, but when you look at the fact that the economy is still growing, when you look at the fact that beyond the challenges of servicing your debt, and that's what the relief that you get. I heard someone say that the IMF may not necessarily bring us money, but I think what it does is that it stops a run on your reserves, it stops a run on your bonds. And I think if we have that stability over the next 12 to 15 months, I believe that the country will see a turnaround. So I'm not too pessimistic about why we are in the IMF. It's unfortunate that we were forced there because the policies that the government brought did not get the support that it required. So it had actually no option.
I see. In 2016, the Africa Report, for example, had an interview with the president, at the time a candidate. And he asked him the question, do you support the government borrowing from the IMF? And the president's response was that it is very sad. It's a very sad development in our country. We worked very hard to rid ourselves of IMF dependency. The sooner we find a way to govern ourselves intelligently and honestly, the better it will be. It is a very sorry tale. Mismanagement and widespread corruption have brought us where we are now. If we don't have the capacity to accept the dictates and the discipline of the IMF program, it will just be another program. Question: how much of mismanagement and widespread corruption could be blamed for where we are today?
Well, I think, first of all, what was the context in which that statement was made? You had a country, okay, that had just discovered oil and was producing oil, okay, in commercial quantities. 2 years down the line, without any global crisis, not like what we saw in 2007, 2008, okay, without any global crisis. The president goes to the IMF because what? CD had lost its value by 30 to 40%, and really we were in difficulties. So that was the context in which that statement was made. But since then, nobody denies the fact that we were hit in the first quarter of 2020 by a pandemic that the world didn't expect. Since then, nobody thought that prices of grain, prices of maize, prices of crude oil and all that would go where they are because of the war in Ukraine. And a combination of these factors actually has the whole world under pressure. The struggle is global, okay? So we have to ask ourselves, internally, you come out with a policy as a government and you think that you need to raise revenue from this new source because we have a situation where 4 years ago, less than 40% of Ghanaians were using the banking system. Today, it's about 95%. Look at the trade that's happening within the electronic space. And the government says that, look, I have to tax this transaction in order to tackle the problems that we're facing. And then it's rejected. So when you reject it, what do you expect the government to do? What do you expect the government to do? To sit down and say that I'm going to take a dogmatic view, and if the IMF is where I have to go, I will not do it? No. So I think really it's important to not say that, yes, because Akufo-Addo said certain things in 2016, those things should actually guide his decisions today. Decisions that you take as a government. Okay?
Except that the suggestion now is that we are late, and this should be my question to you before I go around again for the other views, particularly from the professionals, so to speak. The question being asked now is that because of the posturing of the government, Ghana beyond aid, we won't go to IMF, obviously because of previous comments, you know, and even before the 2020 elections. For example, you had said on the 22nd of March that you wanted to give us a reminder, and you said it was President John Mahama who took oil-rich Ghana back to the IMF. He did that because he had run the economy down and needed to be rescued. He's asking for your vote again in 2020. So people should watch out what sort of a person they were going to hand the economy to. Because of some of these comments, you could have acted a lot proactively, but because of these comments that will be seen to hurt you, you couldn't
repeating yourself, Samson. You keep repeating yourself. What is the point? Look, this is the most universally complex policy environment of our lifetime. This is the IMF saying this. Okay? The situation that the world is in today had never been seen before.
That is if we agree.
No,
that is if we agree. If we all agree that COVID is completely responsible, and then Ukraine.
I mean, how can COVID be completely responsible? The point is, what you have to realize is that
before Ukraine, the government said COVID. Then COVID came, Ukraine came, and we added Ukraine to COVID.
The government saying,
but the World Bank says the problems were foreseen even ahead of COVID.
Can you allow me to speak? I mean,
please go on.
Don't pretend as if you don't live in this world. You live in this world. You know what is going on in this world. Before COVID, the government was tackling the situation that we had in Ghana. And the numbers attest to that. Do you deny the fact that inflation was down to 7.9%? Do you deny the fact that growth was 7%? Do you deny the fact that they were still fixing roads? They were still paying for free SHS? They were still what? Investing more money in anti-corruption institutions. We're employing more people within the health sector. We're employing more people in the police. We're employing more teachers. Do you deny all these things? You don't. You don't deny all these things.
So the question is that, because your pride will be hurt, bruised, you have delayed. And this lateness will cost us even more.
The delay, if you want to talk about delay, ask yourself, why did also Parliament delay in passing the solution that the government had brought before it? Those are the questions that you must have the answers for.
Even after going to Parliament, the minister said, we will not go to IMF.
Of course, because the minister believed that he had a solution, and that's the solution that we had. And what has happened to that solution? We have seen less than 20% of the projected revenues coming from E-levy.
That was predicted, was it not?
What was predicted?
That E-levy was on the way to go.
Predicted by who?
Analysts. Including Imani.
Imani are now going to dictate to us how to run a country. Let me explain something to you, Samson. You are looking at a government, and I'm talking specifically about the MPP, and I will go back to 2000. Look at their record. In 2000, they came, we had economic crisis. They brought a solution. And by the time we left office in 2008, there were challenges because there were financial crises, okay? And those challenges did not stop the debt crisis from coming down, did not stop President Kufuor from actually leaving a legacy, including rich oil Ghana, okay? In 2017, what were the crises? You had a crisis where people can go to the bank and they could not even get their own money. The money that you have deposited in your own account, you could not get access to.
In 2017, we can talk about 2 extra oil fields. We can talk about the support that came from the World Bank, the IMF, and even the Bank of Ghana for COVID.
Samson, you can talk about 2 oil fields. Look at the barrels that are coming from those oil fields. How are they different from what we had a few years ago? Those are the things that you should also look at. How are they different? You can talk about the support from the IMF. Was that what paid for the salaries of teachers and doctors and public servants who stayed at home and were still being paid? The support that was given to the electricity sector.
So when you make the comparison, when you take the comparison to the NDC, you are told what the facts are. You have had such enormous resources. And Felix said a while ago, over 500 billion.
Over 500 billion of what? Over
revenue.
Samson, you are looking at revenues and you are looking at expenditure. Okay? What have you seen over the last few years? You have seen that there's more money going into roads. There's more money going into even services out there. I heard Felix said that when they left office, it was 10 billion. It wasn't 10 billion. 2016, it was 18 billion. And when you look at the budget statement that was brought to Parliament in November 2016, government could not even tell how it was going to sort of fund beyond salaries and paying interest rate, where the revenues were going to come from. That was the situation the country was in 2016 going to 2017. Okay? So for me, once you admit that, yes, there were challenges, but yes, by December 2019, the country was on the right trajectory. And then COVID hit. And it hasn't been peculiar to Ghana. Then you had Putin. It hadn't been peculiar to Ghana. But then the government comes to Parliament and says that, look, this is the situation that we have. I propose that we raise more revenue, additional revenue by way of E-levy. And for 6 months, that policy was frustrated. And when that policy is frustrated, what do you expect government to do? It is saying to you that, look, I'm going to go on an IMF program. You and I, as we sit here, we don't know the facts. We don't know the several options. We don't know what the options are.
But people also ask the question that when it comes to borrowing, for example, you have borrowed in excess of, is it 280 billion? What happened before 2016? The rhetoric was that we're getting to unsustainable debt level. Bawumia led the charge so eloquently, and he was believed. Yeah. And now see where our debt bedding is. How do you explain that? Why at all? Why at all will you profess capacity to do better and yet take us to such a circumstance?
Something. Ask yourself, how come even under these difficult circumstances, okay, we don't have to service any sovereign bond in terms of the principal until what, 2025? What you've seen over the last 4 or 5 years is that even government can go borrow, and we saw that happening. They can go borrow at cheaper rates to service all debt.
Okay.
So borrowing per se is not bad if the previous government borrowed at, say, 9%, and I can go and borrow at 6% to help service part of the old debt. I don't think that's bad economic management.
Well, people tell us, today people point to what the borrowing was for and ask the question, you've borrowed so much, enormous. What do you have to show for it?
I think perhaps you have your own set of questions. So when I answer, you don't even listen. You don't even listen. I'm saying that government actually goes to borrow cheaper to service all debts that were more expensive. You don't listen, Samson, because...
All right, we take a break. We take a break here. And gentlemen, when we return, I will return to you all to look at the way forward and what the potential impact of the so-called lateness in going to the IMF will have. I hope we can do that quickly. We'll be right back. You're welcome back to Newsfile. This is your most authoritative news analysis platform. And here on Newsfile, we put Ghana first. My guest, Felix Ofosu, Felix Kwachi Ofosu, former Deputy Communications Minister and NDC parliamentary candidate for Ebura Asebu Kwaman Kese. He's aide to former President John Dramani Mahama. Also on Zoom, Gabi Asare Ochre Dako is a member of the NPP. He is managing partner of the law firm Africa Legal Associates. And we have Professor Charles Godfred Aka, Associate Professor of Economics, Institute of Statistical, Social and Economic Research, ISE, and former Director, Center for Social Policy Studies, University of Ghana, Legon, and also Elikplim Komla Gloyo, who is Associate Professor, Department of Finance, University of Ghana Business School. We had introduced Bright Simmons earlier, but unfortunately, we don't have him. Now, let me get to you, the two professors who have a good background in these matters. Question about, we are late. We could have prevented a lot more hardship if we had gone early. How true is that? And do you also subscribe to suggestions that the finance minister, Ken Ofori-Atta, should not be the one leading the country into this because he is the one who has actually failed? Starting with Professor Charles Godfred Aka.
Thank you, Samson. I don't want to get into the politics of it. So let me be an economist that I am. So I don't think we are late. I think we are late in acting quickly, but not late in going to the IMF. And I still want you to hear me out because the role of the government is very critical in any crisis situation. I want you to assume, for example, that the IMF does not exist, and there's no reason why IMF should bail us out. I mean, before IMF came, countries have existed and have developed. We started our development at independence with Malaysia and Korea. And if you look at where Malaysia and Korea are now in terms of their development, infrastructure, their per capita GDP in Malaysia now, in PPP terms, it's about 100,000 per person. In Ghana, it's about $5,000 per person. And if you track back to 1960, we were almost at the same level. So what did Korea or Thailand or Malaysia do to leave us behind and come to this level of development? Is it the IMF? I disagree. What has been the role of China's central bank and the government of China to bring China where it is? In this crisis, the US Federal Bank has printed and invested and spent about $3 trillion US. They didn't go to IMF. And it's not as if they had the money there. It was a role of the central bank, the Fed of the US. Canada is financing this crisis internally from their central bank. Look, if you look at how much government spent on COVID, they spent about 19.3 billion to fight COVID. They didn't go to IMF. I was sitting somewhere in Afram Plains. I was on a mission field. And the pandemic was just hitting everybody. I was just meditating and saying, what's the solution? People were talking about, no, government didn't have the fiscal space. Think about IMF. I just had an inspiration that the kind of economic models we have been practicing in Africa for these years would never develop us. We will continue to be poor. And it's orthodox textbook economic models that are not really practical anymore, except the fact that they are fancy theoretically and conceptually, and I agree, we learn them in university. I think we need to talk about real practical issues.
This government actually set off to show us the way, didn't it? When it began with an industrialization agenda, one district, one factory, one village, one dam. What then can we say about the impact of that? How many years on?
Well, exactly. That's to some extent, that's the way to go. But I mean, as to whether it was properly well thought up is a different issue. I have a different paper on that. I think I spoke at the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences about a month ago, and there's a paper I produced about how Ghana should industrialize in the current circumstance where we are going Africa free, continental free trade arrangement. That's a different topic about industrialization. But even with that, how do we finance the industrialization? Should we have to go and borrow? Should we go to the IMF? Again, I said no. During the COVID, I sent a WhatsApp to one of the ministers, and I don't want to mention them, and if you want, I can. And I said, look at what other countries are doing. Why can't the central bank step in to support us to come out from this crisis? He said, well, the NDC will say this is printing money here and there, and people will bash out. And I said, look, anybody that says that, tell him that I said so. And I can show you countries that were doing that. He took it to cabinet. People like President Baumia was the vice president, my own friend and colleague, the deputy governor of the central bank, who was my senior in the university, they were there. They approved. The central bank financed 10 billion Ghana cedis out of the 19 billion that they used to fight the COVID. It didn't give us inflation. It was not a crime. It's moral. That 10 billion Ghana cedi is about 1.5 billion US dollars, far more than IMF gave us when we went to IMF for the standard credit facility of $900 million for 3 years. That's $300 million 1 year. If they are now trying to go back to IMF for 2 billion US dollars, I am saying that the central bank can finance about $1 trillion US dollars. Okay. And depending on how it is spent, it should not cause us inflation. That can fix our roads, create the industries, employ the youth on the street. It should not be IMF be the solution. They will not give us anything that can change Ghana in 10 years.
Okay.
So I believe that our problem is the central bank. And the IMF is saying that the central bank is zero financing. Why should it be zero financing? What is the role of the central bank? The cedi is a public good. We don't go and get a cedi from China. The cedi is printed by Ghana. So if Ghanaians are unemployed, go to 37 hospital. I was there yesterday. No beds. Go to Kolebu. No beds. People are dying. Maternal mortality. Why do we sit down as poor country when we can print the cedi and when we can finance industrialization, which other countries have done? So I think that we need to sit down and discuss both NDC and NPP and say, where do we want to go? What are our challenges? And how do we fix it? And how much do we need the central bank to support? And how do we spend it? And I think it's far more than going to that.
Yeah, Prof, except that we appear to know these solutions. We have known them for forever. For as long as I have heard President Akufo-Addo, for example, campaign for elections, he talks about the Gagisbeck economy, and still doesn't look like anything, is working. We are still doing an import-driven economy. Ukraine, Russia, all that way, a little sneeze, and we are all catching cold. A terrible situation for Africa, actually, an African development situation. All right, thank you very much. Now, Prof. Abloyo, what would you say? Are we late? And what are the effects of that? And what is the way forward? What should be our posture in going into the IMF? Do you also want to plead the fifth when it comes to the questions being raised that this finance minister, over a long period, has shown that he's not up to the task and he should simply give way to someone else?
Okay, Samson, thank you very much. So I also stay away from the politics. So I also plead the fifth. I'll stay away from the politics. I think that, going into the IMF program now or later may have implications in terms of making the negotiations a bit more tough for us. Because things are worse than they were earlier on. Okay, but let me also say that even strong countries may be faced with crisis and may need support from the IMF. Okay, so I also wouldn't go into the politics of whether which government is to blame. Okay, but what I'll say is that even strong countries can be faced with crisis and may be forced to go to the IMF. And indeed, the IMF has tried to reform its reputation and to take away the stigma that countries face when they come to the IMF. Now, in terms of a few things that I'll comment on, the E-levy, for example, yes, I think that's a good policy. My challenge is the way it was implemented. Okay, and I wrote a paper explaining how I thought that the E-levy could be implemented. In particular, the percentage on value is a challenge because it forces people to avoid the tax. Okay, and it's well known. There's something called the Laffer effect. If you introduce taxes, it can change people's economic behavior. And that is what we are seeing now. And that is what I predicted before the E-levy was actually passed. I actually took my time with some assumptions to do projections to see what the revenue will be given changes in behavior. So yes, I wouldn't say that E-levy is a bad policy, but I think that the implementation could have been better because we need to raise our tax to GDP ratio. Now, what do we need to do as a country to more or less strengthen us and protect us against future shocks? So one, we need to build our foreign currency reserves, okay? It is also well known that, for example, individuals need to have 6 months of your living expenses as an emergency reserve. We need something like that as a country. We need to build our economic reserves. Two, we need to build our institutions. Okay, so parliament, the judiciary, etc., and reduce corruption. I think that's one of our Achilles heels. Okay, we undertake projects, but because of the corruption, we don't get value for money. Okay, so we need to reduce corruption. Let's pray for good luck, given that we know that some of the circumstances we are facing now are due to external factors, in particular, the Russia-Ukraine war and also the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, so let's pray that those shocks recede and that will be helpful for the economy. We need to change the structure of the economy.
There's a fear that as we go to the IMF, flagship programs, development, work, construction work, and the rest of them, that opens the economy up and for money to be in the system, will all suffer. How far-reaching will that be?
Well, it depends on how we are able to negotiate and argue if these policies are needed. I think we may also need to review some of the social policies. Okay, so for example, the free SHS. Again, good policy, but we can talk about how it is being implemented. Okay, there are people who can actually pay for their children's education. And that has been one of the reasons that have increased our debt position. Again, the one district, one factory, good policy, but implementation, we can also look at that. Okay, so we need to argue that these policies are necessary to promote future growth and increase the stability of the economy. So that will be a matter for discussion and negotiations with the IMF. Yes.
Interesting. Yes, Felix.
Gabi drives a narrative that seeks to suggest that we didn't have any difficulties at all in 2015 and we just ran to the IMF. Look, we faced what I would call...
Or if you did, they were self-inflicted.
No. Doomsaw started in August of 2012. President Obama had been president for barely 1 month. With the greatest respect to everybody listening, he didn't mount the pole to cut wires and ensure that we sleep in darkness. It was the combination of years of underinvestment, especially in the 8-year tenure of Kufuor, preceding President Mills's time. But he took the bull by the horn and fixed it. So it impacted us severely, and it had an effect on all sectors of the economy. And Professor Aka was right when he pointed to that. In addition to that, we had only one oil field. By 2016, we were producing less than 80,000 barrels a day because there was a problem with the FPSO. So we simply could not get the oil out of the ground. It took 1 year to fix that problem. As I speak, Gabi and his friends in government have access to 3 oil fields with close to 150,000 barrels of oil produced a day in Ghana. What was the oil price in 2016? It was $40 a barrel. Today, it is about $100 a barrel. So they have had far more resources than we ever had access to. When I raised the issue of debt servicing, Gabi disputed it. And I urge viewers to just Google the 2016 budget. It's on the Ministry of Finance website. And check Appendix 3A. You will see the amount we paid for interest in 2016. It was 10.4 billion. In 2021, this government paid 35.8 billion Ghana cedis in interest payments. Amortization alone took 15 billion Ghana cedis in 2021. And this year, the numbers are not dissimilar. So it is clear that the biggest problem we have is debt servicing. And until something is done about it, we are going to have the problem that we are having now. The other issue too is that, you see, Gabi and his colleagues in government are overflogging the COVID issue. And I told you in the earlier round that you can see whether COVID is really the cause of our problems by assessing the performance of other countries that face the same problem. Unlike Doomsaw, which was peculiar to Ghana, COVID was a global phenomenon. So you have the opportunity to assess how other countries did and see whether it is remarkably different from how you are faring. And the answer is that we are an outlier. Our situation is much worse. So what is it that we did in Ghana that others did not do that plunged us into this situation? That is where the election-related overspending comes in. And I have to disagree with Professor Aka. You see, the IMF, again, is not a demonic institution. What we call conditionalities are, in fact, prescriptions that ensure that you live within your means. You cannot live outside of your means and expect that you will not fall into debt and the sort of crisis that we fall in. It is a reason why anytime we end an IMF program, we go back to the same problems and we run back to them because they are not here to police our expenditure. What we have historically done is that we have spent far more than we have earned due to mostly political considerations. So the programs that we roll out have more political benefit attached to them than economic prudence. So if we want to end this vicious cycle, we are going to have to make a decision as a country that we will place economic prudence above political spending. The reason why the countries that we like to compare ourselves to in the advanced countries are where they are is that they are prudent in the management of the economy. So their indices are always in the right direction. Since 2019, our deficit has been rising. It was 7.5% in 2018 and 7% in 2019 because government was overspending and they were borrowing. Again, the bit about central bank financing. You see, when you borrow from the central bank, it adds to your debt. So when the MPB borrowed 10 billion from them in 2020, it added to our debt. We did not borrow a dime from them in 2016, so our debt was much lower than it is now. So there are implications for whatever you do as an economy. And when you take certain decisions and they boomerang in your face and they lead to crisis, you don't go blaming external factors when your own attitude and spending patterns is what has plunged you into this particular situation. And something, we have gone to the IMF far too late, and it will impact the sort of program that we have. I believe that we will get an extended credit facility, which will last for about 3 years. Between $2 to $3 billion will be given to us as balance of payment support, which we desperately need. Otherwise, our currency is going to crash. Now, let me address Gabi's attempt to foist blame on the minority for the failure of the E-levy. You see, to begin with, in the 2022 budget, they attempted to increase revenue by over 30% in one fell swoop. That was not going to work. So we told them from the very beginning that those projections were overambitious. And you see that when I told you about the revenue outturns against the projected revenue in the budget, there was a drop of 2 billion in the first quarter alone. So we expect that if you analyze it, we are going to have a deficit of about 10 billion. And that has nothing to do with E-levy. Again, the E-levy was premised on unpredictable customer behavior. You see, unlike VAT, Sam said, this one, I'm sure you've either eaten or you've taken water. VAT is such that whether you like it or not, you are going to pay, even though it is indirect, because our very lifestyles depend on consumption. So once you consume, you pay. But when you come to E-levy, it is based on people's unpredictable behavior. So you find that the people of Ghana have voted against the E-levy with their feet. They have simply refused to do the things that will catch them in the E-levy trap. So they are finding innovative ways to circumvent it. And when government moves...
And in these difficult times and difficult situations, is it fair for President John Mahama to say that and insist that the minority is not going to cooperate and approve any,
first of all,
any loans unless there is a specific what?
Absolutely. It is project. You see, what has happened is that President Mahama
there's a specific expenditure item.
You see, this government, what they actually really need is balance of payment support. They need to show up our revenue. Sorry,
but that's what
external reserves. No. So they've gone for a $1 billion syndicated loan. They claim that it's for some project, but the real intent is to ensure that we show up our reserves, because the Bank of Ghana will take the dollars and give us cedis. Now, the cost at which they are doing that is detrimental to our interest. Now, they are borrowing $1 billion, but we will end up paying a cost of $438 million if you analyze the term sheet, which I have here. I have the term sheet of the loan. I don't know whether those who are criticizing President Mahama's position
have vetted we don't have time for you to go through that.
The term sheet show that we are paying insurance on the 250 million component alone up to the tune of $40.6 million. How do you borrow 250 million and pay $40 million in insurance alone? And then if you calculate the interest, which is 7.29, what they call all-in cost, you have a situation where we are paying $83 million over 5 years as the cost and interest of the loan. If you add this, it is $127 million. How do you borrow 250 million and pay 127 million in addition? The 750 million component, they've not told us about the insurance component yet. And the reason why the insurance is expensive is that those lending to us are taking a huge risk because of the precarious state of our finances. They are not sure that we'll be able to pay. So they are building the risk into the cost. The 750 million component is going to cost us in excess of $350 million. That is even if we do not add insurance, which they are yet to disclose. So all in all, almost $500 million would have to be paid by the taxpayer in addition to the servicing of the principal. So President Mahama is saying that, look, there are cheaper ways. You can get concessionary borrowing from the IMF at around 1%, which will not impose this sort of toll on you. So if you bring a loan that is not concessionary, we are not going to look at it. Again, President Mahama was very specific. He said that if you bring project-specific loans, projects to do roads, water, that have favorable terms, we are going to approve it. Okay, but we are not going to approve any loan that's not non-concessionary and have unfavorable terms for the people of this country.
Thank you. I'll bring Gabi on for his closing comments, including whether he also shares the view that the finance minister...
Well, I think the finance minister should go. He has lost credit.
President Mahama says he should be sacked. I can't expect you to say...
No, not that I heard that. You see something.
Okay, thank you.
In any self-respecting democracy, both the vice president, who has superintended this disaster, and the finance minister would willingly resign their positions.
Okay, so now let me go to Gabi, but before that, let me read some of your messages. And Komla Azaglon Jr. says, so in summary, Mr. Ocheredako is saying government going to the IMF is the fault of Ghanaians because we were unhappy with the E-levy. If they had maintained the road toll, got a mess up there. If they had maintained the road toll and introduced the levy at a marginal rate, perhaps we would have bought into it. Okay, thanks for that. Mohammed Fatihi says Gabi Ochredakun thinks he can use accent and PR gimmicks to sway the mind of discerning Ghanaians. Charlie, we are awake. Then J. Alayon says E-levy policy was frustrated because it wasn't acceptable to the populace. Accept the government's mistakes and let's move on. Listen. The policies of the NPP government have also added to the unsustainable debt burden today. So what's the excuse? Peter Doe Jr. says the same IMF they have deliberately painted as demon in their quest to win political power 2016 and continue to blame their failures, including job creation, till King Kewache party is thrown for exiting from IMF program, and Ghana 3 billion raised from Eurobond. What has changed? Awudu Ibra says there is a ridiculous chorus churned out as wisdom on why the opposition must take a slap for delaying the unpopular E-levy. Was it not crystal clear Ghanaians were not ready to fund Nana Akufo-Addo's frivolous expenditure through E-levy? Africa Do says, why is Gabi making false claims to support his argument? Did he say inflation rates in the UK prior to COVID was in the negative? What is his source? And why does he keep making comparisons to the UK? Why not La Côte d'Ivoire, for instance? Aye says, I'm surprised we don't see excessive and unnecessary spendings as reason for the downfall. Start investigating leaders' assets and you will know the quantum they don't own but stole from the people. Then Elikem official says, according to Gabi Ochredakun, it's simple. We are going to IMF because Parliament passed the E-levy so lately. Like, how on earth can you say this in the face of Ghanaians? All right, so I'll pause here with your messages. I'll return and share a few more. Okay, so Gabi, what will you say? Those who say that we are going in a bit late, and then also that the finance minister should not be at the helm in the circumstances, having presided over the economy for so long. And perhaps what do you have to say to John Mahama also suggesting the way he's posturing and whipping the parliamentary group of the NDC not to approve, certain business of government except the conditions that he has outlined are met?
I think, first of all, maybe let me go back to a suggestion that our central bank ought to have printed money to help solve the situation. We lived in this country in the 80s, where we had inflation around 130%. And a big chunk of the reason was that the central bank kept printing money as a solution to all our problems. So we've been there before. And I think the decision taken by the central bank, which is that now we're going to increase our gold reserves, I think really, to me, that's a responsible way of going about it, because you can't be a major producer of gold and then still be open to the volatility of the currency market. So I think that's a good way of dealing with it. I think Felix, I don't know whether Felix saw figures from Ministry of Finance in 2016 when they were projecting budget for 2017, 2018, 2019. For 2017, said TEPE's numbers were, they projected 56 billion cedis as the value of the budget for the total envelope for 2017. Out of that, the projection was that 17.55 billion, okay, was to service our debts, okay? And when you add that, and the 34 billion that was supposed to go to MDAs, government would have been left with 3 billion to do everything, including capital expenditure. So really, by 2016, we're ending 2016, and government knew that if he had used 10 billion in 2016, for the following year, it was going to use nearly 18 billion to service its debt. That's where we're going. And we must also remember that we moved from 9.5 billion debt in 2008 to over 90 billion by the time they left office. So it's pretty rich for a party that had an oil-rich economy, which we never had as a country, had no crisis to deal with, to take us to IMF. And then today, after all the challenges that the world has faced, a government comes to Parliament with a program to help solve the situation. You fight against it. You fight against it. I mean, you fight against it to a point that for 6 months, the revenues that the government was seeking to raise was not able to do so. And then you turn around and say that your government was doing a better job. So that's the politics of it. But I think really, when you look at it fundamentally...
But that small bit, Gabi, people are not particularly excited that you want to blame the NDC for this.
I'm not blaming. Because, no, I'm just saying. Look,
because there seemed to be a groundswell of public, opposition to the E-levy in the manner it was being introduced.
And what you have to realize something, you're a student of politics, okay? When it takes you 6 months to pass a policy, and it's a policy of taxation, don't forget, when it takes you 6 months to pass a policy, what happens? Over 6 months, you would have generated enough support against it. Nobody likes paying taxes. You get me? So if it takes you 6 months, okay, to do so, and it's easy for the opposition to lash around it and then build public sentiment against it, because this tax would have affected a lot of people. But then that's the only way. Felix spoke about Japan. Their debt-to-GDP is over 334%. Okay, in US it's over 108% or 128% or so. But why are they not in trouble? They are not in trouble because they raise enough revenue, okay, to service their debts and then to do the other things that they have to do. So I think really what we need to have is a national conversation. If we want our roads done, if we want more teachers in the classroom, if we want to pay better salaries to public sector workers, what do we have to do? There are about 3-4 things. We all know what they are. First of all, we must pay taxes. Secondly, we must make sure that our taxes are used responsibly in a transparent and prudent manner. But it's a give and take. It's a give and take. And I think really when you have an opposition party, okay, which believes that nothing matters but political capitalization of situations, and can go out to the public and say that, yes, praise us because we stopped the government from getting its way in raising revenue to solve the situation and the problems facing the ordinary Ghanaian, then I think really those are the things that we have to also focus on. And my parting words will be, look, I will say to Ghanaians, trust the NPP, because they have shown that when they meet crisis, okay, they find solutions to those crises. And I think what we have to also look fundamentally where the country is going in terms of the spending in building our infrastructure base, in terms of the spending in educating Ghanaians. If we educate our people, offer them secondary education, look at the investment that is going to TVET, vocational training, look at the investment that is even going into universities in terms of access to scholarship and the rest of it. If we're able to do this, and we're able to also industrialize, as we see, over 120 factories are coming up, and more will come up. You see even factories coming in terms of in vehicles, manufacturing or assembling and all that. So I think that by and large, we are going the right way. We are facing fiscal challenges now. It is not peculiar to Ghana, but our case has been made worse by the weaknesses that we had in our system historically. So I believe that, look, IMF, nobody wanted to go to the IMF. John Mahama didn't want to go to IMF in 2015. Ghana certainly didn't want to go to IMF, but we are a member of it. And if we need that respite to help us get us back on track, let's take full advantage of it. But let's also understand that we have in office a government and a group of people that have a history of giving us solutions.
What are your worst fears as we go to the IMF? Because you're going to be policed. You are going to be policed in how you spend and do a number of things. People have been complaining that it is reasonable for you to take a second look at the expenditure into free SHS and the manner it is done. People have questions about a number of the projects, including how much we don't know is going to go into a national cathedral, for example. What are your fears?
I mean, my fears, first of all, is that there are certain things that I hope that we will have the sensitivity to protect. One of the things is about even employment in the public sector. You know, every individual you lay off, okay, you are denying families income. We need to look at that, okay? And we've seen it before. We saw it in 2015. There was a freeze and the rest of it. I mean, of course, we all have to bite the bullet, but we have to look at it. But even if you look at policy-wise, this year alone, there's been a 30% cut on the government's own projections in terms of what it was going to spend. And that is the country struggling because contractors are not getting as much money as they wanted in order to build our infrastructure. That is one area that I'm afraid of. Beyond that, I think that government is not necessarily going to the IMF because it lacks the discipline, but it's going to the IMF because it gets to a point, as we've seen with the Fitch credit ratings downgrading and the rest of it, gets to a point that if you are not careful, you don't get that support. Confidence may itself be difficult to get. Because right now, even if you want to go to the private sector to borrow, you will not get it. So it will give us the confidence. It may not necessarily give us the money, but if we have that respite, where we can then get some macroeconomic stability, then the government has, if you like, the freedom to go out there and implement the policies that will transform us. Certainly, it's not the IMF that's going to transform us. And we know that for a fact. We know that. So I agree with the professors who spoke earlier. And it's not the IMF that's going to transform us.
Do you expect
where we're running out of options as a country?
Finally, do you expect that government could be asked, for example, to do what, say, Dr. Stephen Amwa suggests, delay some of the institutions, because we have had institutions that have 2-3 deputies, and people say this is waste, we don't need them. And then the size of government itself, that you are not tightening enough. We have a historically, bloated government. In the presidency
Samson, I think we need to be very careful when we talk about the size of government, okay? Because, look, if you don't have enough prosecutors across the regions, what does that mean? It means that people are spending too much time in custody, okay? Justice is being denied. And when they spend time in custody, what happens? They have to be fed. Is that not the case?
No, often we are looking at, say, number of ministers, like what we have never had before.
It's easy to look at the number of ministers. The number of ministers we have in Ghana now is no different from what we had in 2016. The number now. If you want to go further down, it's an idea.
2016?
Go and look at it. Look at the numbers. I look at numbers. I don't look at propaganda. Look at the numbers. Look at the numbers that you can make the argument that cut down on the numbers of ministers. You can look at all that. But clearly, we have a government that this year, it has cut down expenditure by 30%. That must mean something. Perhaps you should go into the details and ask yourself, what is suffering?
Okay.
Because it's gone down 30%. Imagine your salary being cut down by 30%. And that's exactly what has happened in terms of government expenditure. So clearly, you can't say that there's too much waste, even if there is waste. And I would not deny that there isn't waste. But you can see that realistic and tangible efforts are being put in to cut down on expenditure. And that itself must mean something. But it's easy to get up and say, oh, cut down a number of ministers. We may cut down. You can cut down to about 9.
Should the finance minister stay, or his style, someone else need to take over?
Well, I think that the finance minister has shown that he has creativity, he has innovation. He needs a support. He needs a support, first of his own party. And I won't even reduce it to the finance minister. I'll take it up to the president. They need the support of their own party. They need the support of parliament. They need the support of Ghanaians, because it's absolutely clear that this is not a party that does not come up with solutions. They do. But if those solutions are going to work, particularly when you have effectively hung parliament. I think that they need the support of the country. And I think if the country can unite and say that, look, we'll give you the mandate, we'll give you the support to implement the policies that will get us out of this crisis.
I suppose that if the government is listening enough, I suppose that it will get all the support it requires from Ghanaians. But when you check, the impression you have out there is that this government is not listening anymore.
It's easy to say so because it's easy to say so that government is not listening. Government comes to parliament with 1.75% as E-levy. It was reduced to 1.5 because there are two things. You need to listen, but you need to also act. And at the end of the day, if you don't act in a way that you see will inure to the national benefit, and you follow populism all the time, if you're not careful, when it comes to making account for your stewardship, you have issues there. So I think really, for me, if you look at the history of the NPP in office, whether under President Kufuor or under Akufo-Addo, they will face challenges as every government will face challenges.
Okay, so if we have to talk about allotment of time to my speakers, I would say that I have been most unfair to all of my speakers. Gabi, thank you so very much for making time.
Well, you don't get me often. So.
You'll be discussing the demonstration with us, but we have very little time for that. My guests have been Gabi Asare-Kyereh-Darko. He's member of the NPP and managing partner, Africa Legal Associate. Also here in the studio is Felix Kwakye-Ofosu, aide to former President Mahama and parliamentary candidate, former for Asebu, Ebura Asebu Kwamankese. He was also Deputy Communications Minister. Professor Charles Godfred Aka, Associate Professor Economics in Institute of Statistical, Social and Economic Research, ISE, and former Director, Center for Social Policy Studies, University of Ghana. Thank you very much. He, together with Eli Klim, Komla Agloyo, Associate Professor, Department of Finance, University of Ghana, they take leave of us. Joining us quickly for a very brief intervention is Dr. Theo Echampong, political risk analyst and economist. Doc, you have followed so far. Let's hear you in the next 5 minutes maximum, what you think the approach should be going forward as we go to IMF.
Yeah, good morning, and for sure, I've been listening quite keenly and listening to my senior brother Gabi also talk about the government listening and them reducing the E-levy from 1.7 to 1.5. But I think if they were listening a bit more keenly, what would have been quite obvious is that 1.5% rate would never have been implemented in the first place. Because in a number of other African countries that have implemented this, they are doing 0.2, 0.3, sometimes 0.4. So what makes Ghana so special to think that if you did 1.5, you actually will collect that? Forgetting that there's...
Well, you guys said these things earlier, and they told you that they had done their research twice. They had done research, and the evidence was that people embraced it. Unfortunately, the evidence now is obvious. They got it wrong.
So that is the issue with policy making, in my view, with this particular administration, that, you know, the evidence base, the data that we need to subject to very strict, rigor to be able to make very objective policy decisions on, I think sometimes it's lacking a little bit. And so what that means is that policy implementation becomes rather ad hoc. And when we then implement, we are now forced to go back and reject things. I personally think we can actually do much better in that regard by engaging stakeholders much earlier in the process. Let it be a much more consultative, and let the evidence lead you to making the kind of right, correct decisions. I don't think on the E-levy, using just that as an example, clearly that wasn't, the case. Be that as it may, we are where we are now, where we have to go to the IMF, and we literally are looking possibly at two things, because the IMF would bring you some sort of balance of payment support. In other words, some dollars to meet your immediate liquidity challenges that we face, servicing our external debt. That's the pressing issue that we have in the short term to deal with the economy. And then the second aspect really is more about what we need to do ourselves in terms of the structural reforms that we need to undertake in that regard, right? And that's where I think really it gets interesting, because in my view, we have bastardized and politicized the whole IMF engagement process such that, we are not having a proper conversation as a country on what we need to take going forward in terms of reforms, fixing the economy, fixing the supply side, demand side, the role of the central bank, deficit financing. All these things are big conversations that need to be had. The problem is that when MPP is in opposition and let's say NDC is in power, they bastardize them for going to take similar course of action. And then when the foot is also on the other one, the same thing seems to be done. So the problem really, in my view, is a bigger political economy problem. And the solutions that are required, some of them we know, others we need to have a broader national conversation on what is required going forward. But we need to address the pervasive or the entrenched politicization of the issues first, because if we don't address this, believe you me, in 5-6 years' time, these external shocks are not going anywhere. In fact, the way the world we live in now, we're going to have more and more of such shocks. And we need to fundamentally, as a country, sit down to really, for once, fix the issues devoid of MPP, NDC, and all of that. But the politicians or the policy makers and the way the politics is practiced in this country is very much at the heart of the problem that we're discussing here. So we can find all the solutions that we want. If we don't address the politics and the way incentives are created in the system, unfortunately, we'll find ourselves back down. And in terms of solutions, I have already outlined some sort of 10-point agenda or 10-point plan, somewhat that we can adopt. But the first thing I think the government needs to do, or the president needs to do, is to send a signal. We need a major reshuffle in this country. I think some of the ministers and some of the appointees perhaps have gotten a little bit too comfortable, to be a bit charitable. And it's time that we see some people being moved and bring in other people on the bench who could actually equally contribute. Because if you've been doing the same thing for...
On your list, will that include the finance minister?
I think perhaps, the finance minister, because ideologically, philosophically, and he's on record as having said that he doesn't support Ghana going to the IMF. Perhaps, and I use that word advisedly, the time has come for him to take a bit of a step back in this regard. But there are other people, I think, in government, other ministers, other appointees that the president really needs to sit down with his team. If
you bring the principal decision until now, the principal stance of the NPP that don't go to IMF, then you would include the president too, because he also in opposition said that it is only mismanagement and act of incompetence if you have to get into IMF. Gabi himself didn't believe in that. But now the circumstances have clearly forced, as he said, that we have to embrace the IMF. So if that is the basis, then what should the president himself do? He too didn't support going to IMF.
Except that in the case of the president, it is Ghanaians who in 2024 will make that decision. It's as simple as that.
Can you just run through the list for us?
I mean, I said a number of things. First thing is we should have a reshuffle. Some ministers must go. the watchword is efficiency and delivery in public service. We must also see some demonstration in terms of the cutback of wasteful spending. The government said that they were going to cut the expenditure or the budget by 30%. Has that already been done? And if so, which areas are that in? On revenue generation, I am against the E-levy. My position on this is quite clear. What we can do to raise more revenue in the medium short term, pass the tax exemptions bill, and we will be able to plug some of those loopholes. The question of Article 71, we've debated this on your platform ad nauseum, but can we, even if not scrapping, significantly reduce that? Possible. As part of the IMF program, I think a number of the government flagship programs will be on the table for debate. So things like your free SHS, one district, one factory, even if you're not going to be scrapping them entirely, can we introduce efficiency savings within that? And if people want to, for example, pay fees, why should they be stopped from doing that? In terms of the central bank financing of the budget and the inflationary effects that creates, I think that's also something that we need to really work really at in terms of better coordination of both the monetary policy and then the fiscal policy. In the next budget that would be read, either in the media or the full year budget, I think the issue of the road tolls, we should go back to it. It was a wrong idea to have scrapped it in the first instance. Luckily, we only zero rated it, so we can, in a way, kind of bring it back. But beyond all of that, what we really need is a proper sort of soul-searching approach to really dispassionately, diagnose all these issues. At the core, like I started, is that there's too much partisanship, and the partisanship is really clouding a lot of efficient or effective decision-making in government. And perhaps some of the appointees, in all honestness, should, in fact, maybe learn some humility, as much as those of us also criticizing and offering solutions also need to do, because we don't know it all, and we need consensus approach to nation building.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Cho Champong. We will take a break here, and when we return, we have very limited time to make a small analysis, very brief analysis of the Arise Ghana demonstration. But before that, you've sent tons of messages. I'll try to read as many as I can. We'll be right back.